very start of this project, we all noticed a popular trend in our research that most archives and museums with LGBT history were from London. And while we initially planned a trip down to London to see some of these archives in person, obviously our plans had to change. This did not change, however, the number of resources that were originally from London, as we catalogued websites based on the origin of their headquarters. Our initial process focused on archiving the most easily accessible resources, so the ones that would be most articulate of the typical experience of an LGBT researcher from any station. Therefore, we came across mostly better funded, larger and often London-based organisations, particularly at the beginning. This included results such as the British Library, the Museum of London, and even when we were searching for more academic resources, while Manchester, Liverpool and Brighton followed, London-based resources were the most frequent. London is obviously one of the largest cities in the world. It's the UK capital. It has a much denser population than anywhere else, so it makes sense that a lot of the well-funded sites and archives are based here. But it can skew perceptions of the LGBT community. If it's only London and other major cities that have deposits of queer history, is it only here that the community exists? Larger cities do have a reputation of being more diverse and more metropolitan, but if queer history from rural areas is never communicated or represented, is there LGBTQ history that's being lost or erased in comparison to a few key elements that are recycled across various metropolitan archives? For it is not simply that most archives are just based in London, most archives also focus on London-based history. As a centre of law in the UK, this makes sense. This is where the laws are made, this is where the protests happen, but other elements of queer history, such as newspapers, music, magazines, protests, pride, they can come from all over the country, and they have historically. So why can't we see that reflected in a lot of our archives? Well, to some extent we can, as most cities have their own resources. They may be smaller and disconnected from the larger and more popular and easily accessible archives, but they still exist. For example, Gay in the 80s is an online archive run by Colin Clues, and it focuses much on his personal experience. This is predominantly in the 80s, as the name might suggest, but it also reflects a lot of the gay experience of the East Midlands, an area that's not often included in LGBTQ+ archives. And while this is harder to find than larger institutions, it technically has the same point of entry, the same availability, the same accessibility as larger archives as it exists on the internet. And especially in the contemporary climate, this is how anyone is accessing LGBTQ+ history. In this sense, the internet has been a great equaliser for a lot of LGBT archives, but accessibility does differ. The most easily accessible archives are the better funded ones, because they have been the most populated over time, because they have existed with more support for longer. So accessibility and financial support are still clear markers of what history is privileged over other elements. It therefore becomes clear that current popular, and by this I mean general and broad, exposure to UK queer history is governed by financial situation and London-based views on LGBTQ+ history. Though it is possible to gather a wider viewpoint from the amount of resources that are available online, but this is only if one is particularly dedicated to their task of research. For it's in the smaller archives that we find more personal narratives and experiences, while larger archives seem to focus on more political events and general shifts over time. You find the much more intimate stories in smaller archives. Academic resources kind of walk the line between both of these things, with personal artifacts and legal documents sitting side by side, but they are, again, hard to access, and the websites for these archives are hard to navigate. Their interface systems aren't as accessible as, again, websites such as Stonewall, the Museum of London, they are much more user-friendly. And even then, they still mostly focus on London-based history. And that makes sense, as many of these archives are still London-based. So what does this mean for Mancunian LGBT history? The information certainly exists, and collating it into an online archive or perhaps an in-person museum in Manchester would not be impossible. It just lacks the proper funding and support to do so. Finding elements of LGBT history from Manchester and also the East Midlands, which is where I'm originally from, has been an important and insightful experience for me as part of this project, as it has allowed me to contextualise myself as a young queer person in a broader history. And I therefore believe that the curation of a Manchester-focused LGBT archive aimed at a popular audience, and that is to say the general public, so maybe a museum or an easily accessible website, would be a beneficial improvement to the state of contemporary LGBTQ+ archives, as it would allow the contemporary community to take ownership of their own histories and their identities, particularly those based in Manchester, which already has a large queer community.